Thank you for joining me, everyone. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years. And I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was unable to leave the house. I was on disability from work and happened to get paired up with a psychologist who, even back in the late 90s, was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And this is what he offered me as a way of dealing with the issues I was going through. And I was not thrilled with his suggestion. I couldn't work. I couldn't be social. I couldn't go to the corner store to buy something. I couldn't leave the house without melting into a puddle of panic. Here's this guy talking about watching the breathing and stuff. I'm like, the hell is this? So, didn't think much of it, but I gave it a shot anyway. She gave it a shot anyway. And here I am, quarter of a century later. Still doing it. Teaching. And I'm going to keep doing it a while longer, I think. It's working out pretty well so far. So, here I am. And here you are. Thank you for being with me. This is the next in our ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully, where I like to share some of the tools and techniques that people have shown me, that I've stumbled upon for myself, sometimes new ones I'm still discovering myself, because I find that this human condition of anxiety, fear, stress, right? We all have different challenges in our lives. We all have different things in our lives that bring up these kinds of feelings, but we have the commonality of all experiencing them. And I find that there's also a lot of commonality among the effectiveness of these various tools and techniques. So perhaps today's will resonate with some of you as it has resonated with me and so many others. So let's jump in. Okay. I always like to begin my sitting by imagining I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head, as a nice way to remember to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. Any tension that may already be here, if any, is perfectly allowed to be here. I've found that if I try to force tension away, that really involves bringing more tension to the tension that's already here. That doesn't really help get rid of tension. So I found that I can just notice whatever tension might happen to be here, physically, mentally, emotionally, and just notice that it's here. Let it leave in its own time, which may or may not be today. And if there's a lack of tension here, there's no need to try to generate tension for the purpose of noticing it, right? So we just notice, there's a relative lack of tension. That's what's here. It's less about what we've brought with us and more about simply noticing what it is. And even if we don't really know exactly what it is, we can notice what it feels like. Just gauging what our starting point is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And you may notice, as soon as you bring your attention to your breathing changes. Sometimes we think we need to have a certain kind of breathing for our meditation practice. And there are some meditation practices where we deliberately control the breathing, but we don't have to do that here. I mean, we can. We don't have to. And I usually don't. Just as we can notice if there is tension here without trying to change it, interfere with it, we can do the same with the breathing. Notice the breathing that's here without necessarily trying to interfere with it and change it. Often we find when we try to just leave the breathing be, it's actually quite difficult. We start to notice the extent to which we do shape and control it when we bring our attention to it. Even if we don't mean to. As we develop our practice, sometimes we start to notice more and more subtle levels of shaping and control of the breathing that we hadn't realized we were doing. We don't have to fight with that. That's like bringing tension to tension again, right? Trying to control the controlling, to make it stop, which doesn't really make a lot of sense when we put it that way. So if you're noticing some shaping and controlling of the breathing, you don't have to try to stamp that out. You don't have to try to control the controlling. Just notice that it's there. See what it's like. See what the effect of simply paying attention to it over time is. We're simply directing our attention and seeing what happens. And then directing our attention to what it is that happens. And then seeing what happens from that. Just gathering data. Notice if your attention slips away. Perhaps to a daydream, fantasy, some storyline about something, memories. We often think when we're engaging in a meditation practice, we have to stop all that. We're not supposed to be thinking. But that's just a thought in itself, isn't it? I'm not supposed to be thinking. All right? That's a thought. So, too late. We have minds that think. That's not an interference with the practice. It's kind of why we practice, right? It's what we're here to work with. It's what we're here to see. We're not here to stop thinking. We're here to practice directing our mind more skillfully. So we often anchor on the breathing because there's so much there that we can see. Like those levels of subtle shaping and controlling I was talking about before. Because we don't just do that with the breathing. We do that with all kinds of things. Some things that we can control, we even try it with some things that we can't. Try it with a lot of things that we can't. And how's that working out for us? Does that cause stress and suffering, or does it alleviate stress and suffering? If we find that it's causing stress and suffering, then, well, maybe we want to do something about that. That's what this practice is about, is taking a step back and developing our clear seeing so we can notice, oh, here's what I'm doing. Here's where I'm getting in my own way. And introducing stress and suffering. That doesn't need to be here. And then sometimes we cause ourselves stress and suffering trying to get rid of the stress and suffering we've brought, right? Again, bringing tension to tension. So, we just see. What arises in the body, in the mind, thoughts, feelings. If we just sit with the breathing without trying to do anything about it. It doesn't matter so much what comes up. What matters is that we notice what comes up. And then it matters what we do with what comes up. So we stick with the breathing, continue to notice. Notice the tendency to want to do something about it. But right now, we're just gathering data. We're breathing and gathering data. And again, if the mind slips off, that's just more data. Oh, the mind slipped off. Here's where it went. And when I've realized I've slipped off, either because I realize it myself or because something happens that brings me back to the present, and then just notice, oh, here's my thoughts and feelings about having slipped off. Sometimes I just notice, oh, I slipped off, come back. Sometimes we may start to berate ourselves. Oh, I'm terrible at this. I don't know what I'm doing. You just notice that. That's just another thought, another data point. Oh, look what arises. That's not a failure of the practice. That is the practice. That is what we are here to do right now. That's what we're here to see. That's the wonderful thing about this practice. Nothing is outside of it. Now, there are right ways and wrong ways of doing the practice. But anything that comes up, we can practice with. We have that option every single time. We always have that choice. We don't get to choose what comes up. We don't even get to choose our initial reaction to what comes up. That's automatic. But we do get to choose how we respond. What do we do with what comes up? What do we do with the reaction we had to what comes up? What do we do based on the new data we have gathered based on that experience? It's amazing how much comes up. when we just sit and try to direct our attention solely to the breathing. Such a simple thing. In fact, that's part of what makes it so difficult. It is such a simple thing, and our minds often rebel against that. It's not used to just doing one simple thing. And again, that's what we came to see. It's like, wow, look what comes up in the mind when I just try to do this one simple thing. Look at the chaos that might ensue, the rebellion, the antsiness. The overwhelming urge to do rather than be. Isn't it amazing how sometimes the mind can find simplicity and ease agitating? And again, we don't have to try to stop that agitation, because that's just bringing agitation to agitation, bringing tension to tension. We just notice. If that's what comes up, that's what's here, and this is what it's like. If something else comes up, we notice that. If nothing appears to come up, we notice that. Nothing's off the table. We're just gathering data. As you go through the rest of your day or evening, you may come back to this. Noticing the breathing, noticing what's coming up, our reactions, responses, keeping in mind that we're just gathering data. Just observing, just seeing. Including the seeing of the desire to do more than just gather data. That's also observable. Just gather that data. Okay. Gaining some new information. In my experience, that ends up kind of being enough. The real changes aren't the ones that we try to force. The real changes, the deep changes, they kind of have to happen on their own. But we have to set the causes and conditions for that to happen. And that's what we're doing here. Coming to the breathing, directing our attention skillfully, building our powers of observation. And as we gather enough data and it sinks in at that felt experiential level after seeing it again and again, I found that the shifts just kind of happen on their own. Can't say when, can't say how. Sometimes we don't even notice until some time has passed and we look back and say, oh wow, there's really been a shift. And we just keep gathering data. And we walk the path that it all builds for us. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a few moments, see if there's anything people would like to ask or share in the chat. Let's see from Michelle, even now noticing the control seems only to happen when it's pointed out. New perspective every time. I'm glad I can offer a new perspective for you. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the things in this practice tend to be self-referential or circular. And sometimes noticing of control is one of them. We only notice these attempts to control when we direct our attention to the possibility of there being attempts to control. It's a funny thing. I mean, if we're setting an intention and acting upon it, then we are exercising some control, right? So if we're directing our attention to the breathing, that's something that we are controlling. So that in itself kind of sets the control stage. So when we do then immediately notice the breathing as a result of it, we may continue to engage in some measure of control. And it is very difficult in my experience, I think in most people's experience, to observe the breathing without trying to shape and control it somehow. And a large part of the breath work in this practice is simply noticing again and again over time as we build our skill with doing this. We'll think for a while, oh, I'm not shaping and controlling the breathing, but then our ability to discern finer and finer levels of control, we start to notice, oh, you know what? There is still a little shaping and controlling going on here. And again, that's not a failure. That's actually a success. We are honing our seeing. So when we see a new level of control that was getting by us before, we don't have to be upset and say, oh, geez, I thought I wasn't controlling the breathing, but I am. We say, oh, wow, look at this subtle level of control I wasn't able to see before, but now I can. And then we simply bring our attention to that. Again, data gathering. It's just the sensitivity with which we are gathering our data is becoming greater. So we're seeing more clearly. And again, the point isn't just that we see that with the breathing. The point is we start to see that with everything. We start to see with greater and greater sensitivity the degrees to which we are getting in our own way in our lives. Either through trying to over-control things within us, trying to control things outside of us. So there's a lot of breath work in this practice, but the point isn't for the breathing itself. It's the skills that we're building here based on the breathing. kind of end up translating to everything. You wouldn't think so. It does, on paper, it doesn't seem that way. Like, how the hell does that happen? It happens. At least in my experience, it happens. It's kind of amazing. Something so basic, something so simple. Something so simple, the mind is like, dude, can we do something more exciting? Can we do something more, And then as you continue to do it, it's like, wait a minute, there's actually a lot going on here when you really look at it. But we have to build that skill. And that's what we're doing here. Yeah, Chris, good to see you. Nothing is outside of it. Love it. Yeah, that's just it. It's one of my favorite things about this practice. Even the thought of, I'm terrible at this, or I don't know what I'm doing. Just notice that and you're doing it. I have a mindfulness 101 session that I do at least once a year called Am I Doing This Right? And that's why I call it that, is because anytime we ask, am I doing this right? In that moment, the answer kind of has to be yes. Because what are we doing in that moment that we're asking? We're taking a look at what we're doing, and we're seeing how it's working out. We're paying some attention to it. We're trying to discern how skillful we're being. So it's kind of hard to ask, am I doing this right? Without the answer in that moment being, well, yeah, in this moment I am. All right, can wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for being with me. Hope to see you all again real soon. Cheers, everyone. Take care.